Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The sun in Lowland rose slowly, casting long, golden limbs over rooftops that leaned on one another like tired elders. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and charcoal smoke, a quiet morning symphony that played without invitation. Amara woke before the birds, her body moving with the rhythm of duty more than desire. The mattress was thin, pressing her bones against the hardwood beneath, yet she rose like a tide, silent, steady, necessary. She didn't need an alarm clock. The thoughts in her head were louder than any rooster. She tied her wrapper tightly, walked past her sleeping husband, and began the day by fetching water from the community tap at the back of the compound. The metallic clank of her bucket echoed like a bell across the stillness of morning. It wasn't a glamorous life. Nothing about it glowed. But it was hers. And even in the struggle, there was something sacred about routine, about waking before the world and watching it unfurl from the corners of her eyes. By the time Jude stirred awake, Amara was already inside Madame Evelyn's house, sweeping floors with quick, careful strokes. The compound smelled of hibiscus and bleach. She moved from one end of the corridor to another like a shadow, not speaking unless spoken to. Yet she wasn't miserable, at least not in a way that weighed her down. This was the life they had both agreed to, a life built on grit, humility, and shared dreams. Jude drove Madame Evelyn's sleek silver Camry, while Amara worked as a house help, though Evelyn treated her more like a younger sister than a servant. Their room, a small, single-room extension tucked behind the main house, had little furniture and even less privacy. But it had laughter. It had late-night giggles under the cover of a shared blanket and whispered plans about owning their own shop someday. Theirs was a love forged in sweat and strengthened with patience. They were still learning each other, still discovering the patterns of pain and peace that came with marriage. Amara didn't mind the hard work. She wore it like armor. And Jude, in his own quiet way, was her mirror, reflecting her strength right back at her, wordless but consistent. That morning, as the sun climbed higher and the day wore its heat like a burden, Amara felt a strange heaviness in her chest. Not emotional, physical. It was as if something inside her was trying to speak through her body. At first, she dismissed it. Probably just hunger, she told herself. But when she bent to scrub the kitchen floor and the entire room tilted sideways, she knew it wasn't her imagination. She held the wall and breathed slowly, waiting for the dizziness to pass. A sharp, bitter taste filled her mouth and her stomach churned. She hurried outside to the edge of the garden and threw up quietly, gripping the stem of a plantain tree to keep herself from falling over. Her heart beat wildly, not from fear, but from a strange sort of realization. The kind that creeps in like a whisper and then plants itself like a tree. When she wiped her mouth and stood upright, the sky looked different. She wasn't sure if it was the clouds or her eyes that had changed, but something had. And deep down, under the weight of fatigue and denial, Amara knew. She just didn't want to say it yet. Later that evening, when Jude returned from work, his face shiny with sweat and dust, Amara was sitting on their bed, holding the test result in her hands like a secret too heavy to keep. He greeted her, unaware of the storm behind her silence. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for his hand and pressed the folded paper into his palm. Jude looked at her face, then at the paper, then back at her again. His eyes widened slowly, like curtains parting at dawn. Then to her surprise he laughed, a shaky, boyish laugh that stumbled out of his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a hug that felt more like a prayer. "Are you scared?" he asked, his voice barely louder than the fan whirling above their heads. She didn't respond, only nodded against his chest. And there, in that cramped little room with no fridge and peeling paint, they held each other like two people floating in the middle of an unknown ocean. A baby was coming. A third life in a space barely big enough for two. The joy was real, but so was the fear, sharp, unspoken, and lurking at the corners of every thought. They didn't know how they would manage. But for that moment, they let themselves believe that love, somehow, would be enough. The days that followed the discovery of Amara's pregnancy moved with an unfamiliar stillness, as though the world itself was waiting for something to shift. The news had wrapped itself around their small home like an invisible curtain, casting both light and shadow in equal measure. Jude became noticeably more attentive, often watching her like a man watching the clouds for signs of rain. Every plate of food she touched became a negotiation. "Eat small again, just one more spoon," he would plead, even when she'd already pushed the food aside. Amara, on the other hand, moved as though she were balancing glass in her womb. Her steps became more cautious, her speech more withdrawn. But it wasn't fear that held her tongue, it was the weight of the unknown. With every passing day, her body spoke a language she hadn't yet learned. Aches in places she didn't know could ache, sudden tears without warning, exhaustion that swallowed her whole before noon. And yet, she kept showing up at Madame Evelyn's house, wearing the same gentle face, doing the same careful chores. Evelyn noticed the changes quickly, though she didn't pry. Instead, she offered Amara extra portions of food, subtle medical advice, and longer breaks in the shade. The kindness was quiet, but it wrapped itself around Amara like a shawl on a chilly evening. By the third month, the pregnancy began to show, not just in the soft swell of her belly, but in the way her entire body carried itself. Her face rounded out, her skin took on a glow that only those who lived closely with women in that condition could recognize. Madame Evelyn, with her years of medical experience, began to gently take more of the workload off Amara's shoulders, insisting she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But Amara didn't take easily to rest. She believed deeply that movement was medicine, that staying still was an invitation to helplessness. She would often wake before dawn, sweep the compound, then sit with her feet in a basin of warm water while the sun slowly climbed over the trees. Jude, ever the protector, started saving small portions of his driver's pay in a tin under their mattress. He didn't say what it was for, but Amara knew. It was for hospital bills. It was for the baby's first clothes. It was for the unknown. Their room, though still cramped and colorless, began to feel sacred, like it was holding something sacred within it. Yet beneath the soft conversations and tender touches, a certain tension began to rise, as steady as steam beneath a pot. How long could they stretch their income to fit a new life? Was love truly enough to shield a child from the cold fingers of poverty? Nights in Lowland grew hotter, and sleep became an unpredictable guest. Amara would often lie awake, fanning herself slowly with a worn magazine, while Jude snored softly beside her. In those hours between midnight and dawn, her thoughts grew louder. She wondered what kind of mother she'd be, if her child would grow up craving what she couldn't give. She thought of the women in her village who bore children under mango trees, and went back to farming within weeks. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? She didn't want survival alone. She wanted peace. She wanted a life where the sound of a baby's cry didn't translate to hunger. But such dreams felt far, slippery like fish in wet hands. She tried not to show her worry, keeping her smile steady, her tone light, but Jude saw through the veil. He began telling her small stories, about a man who once carried palm wine through 7 villages just to feed his wife, about a woman who gave birth to twins and built a small shop beside the road, while carrying one baby on her back and the other on her chest. "We are not the first to face this," he'd whisper, "and we won't be the last." His stories weren't always true, but they did what stories do best. They softened the edges of fear, if only for a little while. Still, there were nights when Amara cried quietly into her pillow, not from pain, but from the weight of too many unknowns pressing against her chest. The baby kicked for the first time on a humid afternoon, when the generator had refused to start, and the air felt like hot soup. Amara was washing Nina's tiny clothes, second-hand pieces Madame Evelyn had given her from a friend's charity box, when she felt the flutter, a small ripple beneath her skin like a secret wave in a calm sea. She paused, breath held, hand pressing gently against her belly. It happened again, soft but unmistakable. She called out to Jude, who came running, thinking she was in pain. When she placed his hand on her stomach and the baby responded, his eyes watered without shame. "Our child knows my hand," he said, half laughing, half crying. That moment carved itself into the walls of their home. From that day on, every movement the baby made became a conversation, a reassurance that even though their circumstances were tight, something beautiful was growing between them. But even beauty comes with burden. Amara's back began to hurt constantly. Her appetite wavered. Sometimes she craved things they couldn't afford, boiled groundnuts, fried plantain, pineapple slices soaked in ice. She would laugh it off, telling Jude to ignore her, but the longing in her eyes told another story. Still they managed, because that's what people like them did. They bent, but did not break. They adjusted. They prayed. And when there were no words left to say, they simply held hands and sat in silence, drawing strength from the quiet. The morning Amara went into labor, the air had turned thick and restless, as though the clouds were holding their breath. Rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the zinc roofs like fingers tapping in urgency. Jude had barely returned from an errand when he heard her call his name. Not a scream, but a sharp, low cry that forced his feet into motion. He found her hunched over the plastic table, gripping its edge with fingers white from pressure. Her wrapper was soaked in sweat, and her breathing had changed from shallow sighs to low, guttural hums. Outside, the wind bent trees with a kind of madness, and inside their cramped room, time folded in on itself. Jude rushed to Madame Evelyn's main house, banging on the door with desperation in his knuckles. She answered in her nightdress, eyes widening as soon as she saw his face. She was a doctor, yes, but she was also a woman who had delivered 3 children herself. Within minutes, towels were boiled, water was fetched, and Amara was laid gently on their narrow bed, her moans growing louder with each tightening wave of pain. No ambulance, no hospital bed, just 4 hands. Evelyn's calm, clinical ones and Jude's trembling, desperate ones, working in tandem against the storm. Hours passed like lifetimes. The electricity cut off. The rain persisted. But when the baby's cry finally broke through the noise, it sounded like a trumpet calling an army home. A girl, small, beautiful, and full of fire. They named her Nina, after Jude's late sister, whose memory lived quietly in a drawer of his heart. For the first few days, Amara floated in a fog of fatigue and fragile happiness. Her body felt foreign, stitched, swollen, sore in places she had never thought of before. Her breasts leaked without warning. Her stomach still looked 5 months pregnant, and her head pulsed with a dull ache that sleep never seemed to cure. Yet she smiled when visitors came. She nodded when people said, "You're glowing." But she didn't feel any glow. She felt like a balloon that had been left out in the sun, stretched, limp, and oddly weightless. Jude was overjoyed, showing off Nina to anyone who looked his way. He sang lullabies with a voice that cracked at the edges and changed diapers like he was defusing bombs. Amara watched him with a strange distance. Not because she didn't love him, but because everything felt like it was happening on the other side of a glass window. The baby cried often, high-pitched wails that pierced through sleep and sense, and sometimes, as Amara rocked her to silence, she would catch herself staring at the child without feeling anything at all. Not hatred, not joy, just nothing. It was the emptiness that frightened her more than any pain. A hollow space where love was supposed to live, echoing louder with each passing day. She tried to pretend. She smiled in the mirror. She repeated the names of people who had supported her. But each time she looked at her reflection, she saw a stranger. A version of herself stretched thin and fading fast. The shift happened so gradually, it almost went unnoticed. She stopped singing while washing the baby's clothes. Her conversations with Jude became shorter, more transactional. She no longer asked about his day, nor did she seem to notice when he stared at her with concern knotted across his brow. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the mango trees and cast long orange shadows across the compound, Jude walked into the room to find Amara sitting still, her eyes locked on the wall. Nina was asleep in her arms, but Amara wasn't rocking her. She wasn't moving at all. Jude sat beside her and touched her shoulder gently. She blinked slowly, as if waking from a distant dream, then said softly, "I don't think she likes me." He was stunned. "Who?" he asked, even though he already knew. "The baby," she replied. "She cries every time I touch her. Maybe she knows I'm not ready." Her voice was flat, not dramatic or emotional, just stating facts, like reading ingredients off a label. That night, Jude didn't sleep. He held Nina close and kept glancing at Amara, who lay stiffly on the mattress, eyes wide open in the dark. She looked more like someone who had lost a battle than someone resting. The next morning, he made a decision. He didn't know what was wrong exactly, but he knew she needed help, more help than he alone could give. Jude's journey back to his village took an entire day, riding in 2 cramped buses and walking the final stretch on foot. He arrived at his mother's house just before sunset, dust clinging to his clothes and worry clinging to his spirit. Mama Ezen listened carefully as he explained everything. How Amara no longer smiled, how she avoided the baby, how she spoke like she had forgotten the taste of joy. The older woman said nothing for a long time. Then she stood up, wrapped her head with a scarf, and said simply, "Let's go." By nightfall the next day, they arrived back at Lowland. When Mama Ezen entered the room, Amara looked up and offered a small, uncertain smile. Mama didn't smother her with questions or force a laugh. She simply sat beside her, took the baby from her arms, and began to hum an old lullaby from their village. One with no words, just gentle melody and meaning only understood by the heart. In the days that followed, Mama became a quiet anchor in their home. She cleaned without being asked, cooked without being told, and sat with Amara without expecting conversation. But even with all that warmth, Amara continued to drift. She bathed, ate, even joked sometimes when spoken to, but the light behind her eyes flickered like a lantern running out of oil. And one evening, as Jude and Mama sat quietly beside her, she broke the silence with a sentence neither of them expected. "I want to go back to work." The moment Amara's words settled in the air, her quiet plea to return to work, the room seemed to lose its balance. Jude stared at her, searching for a trace of jest in her face, but all he found was a calm, steady resolve that startled him more than any outburst would have. Mama Ezen didn't speak immediately. She glanced at her son, then back at Amara, whose eyes didn't waver. The baby slept between them, her tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the ticking clock on the wall. Jude swallowed hard, confusion tying knots in his chest. "You just gave birth," he said finally, his voice edged with disbelief. "Barely 2 moons ago. Your body hasn't healed, Amara. You're not ready." But she remained seated, her posture neither defensive nor confrontational. Her tone held no defiance, only exhaustion wrapped in honesty. "I can't breathe in this house anymore. Every wall is closing in. Every hour feels like I'm chasing shadows. I need to feel useful again." She didn't say it with tears or shaking hands. In fact, that was what scared Jude the most, how calmly she confessed the storm within her. Mama, who had been folding baby clothes in a basket, gently set them aside. She stood, wiped her hands on her wrapper, and sat directly across from Amara. Her voice was low, layered with age and knowledge that came from weathering many seasons. "Are you sure it's work you need, or are you trying to run from something that will follow you anyway?" Amara met her gaze, unflinching. "Maybe both. But I have to try." The house was quiet that night, but the silence was anything but restful. Jude couldn't sleep. He lay on his side, listening to the soft sounds of the baby sucking her thumb and Mama Ezen humming some forgotten lullaby in the corner. He kept thinking about what Amara had said, how it landed not like rebellion, but like a quiet desperation. It wasn't just a request, it was a lifeline. He wanted to protect her, but he also feared that keeping her here was slowly pulling her further away. His thoughts spun around in endless loops, until Mama's voice interrupted them like wind rustling dry leaves. "You love her," she said without lifting her head. "But love must be wise. Sometimes, caging a bird to protect it only makes it forget how to sing." Jude sat up slowly, the weight of her words settling heavy on his shoulders. He didn't respond, but she continued. "This isn't about pride or weakness. That girl is drowning, and work may not be the cure, but it might be her rope back to the shore. Let her go. If she's meant to return to herself, she will find the way faster outside these walls than within them." The next morning, with his heart battling his mind, Jude nodded in agreement. Amara didn't smile when he told her. She didn't jump or weep. She simply exhaled, deep, slow, like someone who had been holding their breath for too long. She thanked him in a voice just above a whisper, then went to pack her things. Not all of them, just a small bag with a change of clothes, lotion, and a wrapper. Enough to carry, not enough to stay long. She kissed Nina's forehead, not with guilt, but with hope. When Amara walked through the gates of Madame Evelyn's compound, it felt like stepping into a memory soaked in sunlight. The familiar scent of hibiscus and soap lingered in the breeze, and the sound of the gardener's radio played low from the corner as though time had paused just for her. Evelyn was standing at the doorway, arms folded, surprise flickering across her face. She didn't say anything immediately. She watched as Amara approached, her steps slower but certain. "You shouldn't be here yet," Evelyn said gently, not unkindly. "It hasn't been long enough." Amara nodded. "I know, but I need this. I need to feel like myself again." Evelyn tilted her head, assessing the young woman who once sang while sweeping, the girl who used to dance around the house with a bucket on her head. Now there were shadows under her eyes and a slowness in her voice, but there was also something else, an ember, faint but persistent. "All right," Evelyn said after a pause. "No heavy lifting. No stress. You help where you can and sit when you need to." Amara's lips lifted slightly. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest she'd come in weeks. She picked up a cloth and began wiping down surfaces. With every corner she touched, every stain she scrubbed, something stirred inside her. Not joy, not yet, but a rhythm she remembered. Her body moved not with energy, but with purpose. By midday she had settled back into the flow of work, not out of habit, but out of longing, for distraction, for clarity, for herself. It was during one of the quieter afternoons, while cleaning the study, that Amara overheard a conversation that stopped her in her tracks. Evelyn was speaking to a visitor, another woman who had arrived just minutes earlier with red eyes and a strained voice. The door to the study was open slightly, and though Amara didn't mean to listen, the woman's words came through as clearly as thunder. "I don't feel anything for him," she said. "My son. I look at him, and I don't feel joy. Just fear. Just tiredness." Evelyn's voice came next, calm and measured. "That doesn't make you a bad mother. It makes you human. Birth doesn't always come with bonding. Sometimes it comes with silence. With questions." Amara froze. Her heart began to race, not from fear, but from recognition. Those same words had lived inside her chest, unspoken but loud. She stepped back slowly, letting the cloth fall from her hand. The rest of that day moved in a haze. She washed dishes without thinking. She answered questions with nods. But inside her, something had shifted. Later that evening, as the compound quieted and the moon sat low like a watchful eye, Amara found herself staring at her reflection in the window. The glass didn't lie. Her face still looked tired. But this time, it also looked familiar. The next morning, she woke up before the bell rang. She folded the cloths without being told. And when Evelyn passed her in the corridor and asked how she was, Amara answered, I'm getting better." It wasn't loud, but it was true. Amara's return to work began quietly, not with grand gestures or dramatic changes, but with small decisions made in silence. She woke up each morning just before sunrise, wrapped her hair in the same patterned scarf she'd worn months before, and stepped into Madame Evelyn's compound with a kind of cautious reverence, as if each corner held echoes of her former self. Her hands remembered the rhythm of the broom, the familiar creak of the mop handle, the placement of the buckets and soaps as if they had never left her grasp. But her heart still moved with uncertainty. There were moments when she would pause in the middle of a chore, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular, swallowed by a thought or memory she couldn't name. Yet unlike before, when such stillness left her feeling like a ghost in her own skin, now it carried less weight. Evelyn noticed the change in her, how she worked at her own pace, how she didn't speak much but also didn't flinch from conversation. The other workers, who had quietly filled her space during her absence, gave her room without questions. They had seen women leave and never return. The fact that she came back, even fragile, was enough to earn their quiet respect. In the evenings, when the work slowed and the compound began to hum with the peaceful lull of dusk, Amara often sat alone by the laundry line, watching her hands as they moved, proof that she was still here, still functioning, still fighting. Despite the gradual return of routine, the ache of separation lingered in a corner of her mind she didn't often touch. At night, when the wind carried voices from other compounds and the shadows stretched long under the moon, she thought of Nina. Not with guilt, but with longing, the kind that ached deep and low like a song stuck between lyrics. Mama Ezen sent word every evening through a neighborhood child, always brief updates spoken with simplicity. Nina smiled today, or she drank well and slept. Sometimes Jude added a note of his own. "We miss you here," or "Nina's eyes are starting to look like yours." These messages landed in Amara's heart like tiny seeds, and though they didn't sprout into joy immediately, they grounded her. One weekend, she visited them. The house hadn't changed, but something in her had. She stood at the doorway longer than necessary, suddenly nervous to cross back into a space that had once swallowed her whole. When she finally stepped in, Nina looked up from Mama's lap with wide, blinking eyes. The baby didn't cry or smile, just stared, studying Amara as though trying to place her in memory. Amara held her gently, not with the urgency of a mother seeking redemption, but with the quiet care of a woman slowly finding her way back. Jude watched them from across the room, his face a mixture of pride and relief. They didn't talk much that night. They didn't need to. The silence between them had softened, no longer heavy but healing. Back at Madame Evelyn's, things continued to unfold in layers. Amara had begun assisting with new tasks, taking inventory of supplies, helping prepare for visits from patients who came seeking Evelyn's private consultations. Though she had no formal medical training, her presence became dependable. She was observant, careful, and began to carry a notepad where she scribbled instructions and reminders. Evelyn never pushed her, never assigned her more than she could carry, but her subtle encouragement served as a balm. One afternoon, while reorganizing cabinets in the study, Amara found an old picture of Evelyn with a woman who looked strikingly similar. Curious but respectful, she asked about it. Evelyn hesitated, then explained that it was her sister, someone who had lost herself after childbirth and never returned. She didn't have the support she needed, Evelyn said softly, her voice not breaking, but dipping into a sadness that felt old and worn. Back then, we didn't talk about these things. We didn't know how. Amara felt her chest tighten. She hadn't heard those words spoken aloud before. They settled deep inside her. Later that night, she sat in the back of the compound, eyes turned to the stars. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but full of stories she hadn't yet told, even to herself. She began to wonder how many women like her were walking around, silently unraveling behind smiles and good intentions, carrying burdens that had no names in their language. One morning, as the clouds hung low with promise of rain, a patient arrived. A young woman with a newborn strapped to her back and tears clinging to her cheeks like broken glass. Amara greeted her at the gate, offered water, and led her inside with the same quiet composure she had once faked. But this time, the woman's trembling voice struck something deep. "I don't sleep anymore," she whispered to Evelyn. "I don't even want to hold her sometimes. I feel like I'm not normal." Amara stood just outside the doorway, her hands pressed against her chest. She knew this woman, not by name but by ache, by silence, by the shadow that once followed her every movement. Evelyn, with her usual calm, offered support, but it was Amara who stepped forward before she even realized her legs had moved. She sat beside the woman and placed a hand on her knee, not with sympathy but solidarity. "You're not alone," she said simply. "And you're not broken. You're just tired. I was too." The woman looked at her, startled by the honesty, and in that brief moment, something passed between them, a thread, a connection, the start of something healing. It was then Amara understood that her return to work had never been about the chores or the structure. It had been about reclaiming her voice, the one she thought she'd lost to mirrors and midnight tears. She was not the same girl who had once scrubbed these floors with songs. She was something else now, still soft but no longer fragile. The seasons in Lowland didn't shift with dramatic flair, but over time, even the dust began to carry different moods in its wind. The air, once heavy with dampness and uncertainty, now smelled of ripe mangoes and the kind of warmth that followed long-awaited rain. Amara found herself walking differently, not faster, but steadier, like someone who had spent enough time lost and now finally understood the value of each careful step. The compound was still the same in structure, the same brown walls, same rusted gate hinges, but something inside her had rearranged. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in. They had become familiar rather than threatening. Her work no longer served as a distraction from her emptiness, but now existed as a part of her healing. There was something quietly victorious about changing the sheets, stacking dishes, wiping dust from corners others didn't even see. It wasn't the tasks that defined her worth, but her ability to choose them again on her own terms. With each day, she began to speak a little more, share stories over lunch breaks, and even laugh, though the sound still caught her by surprise. What had once been a dull silence hanging over her was now broken into intervals by voices, her own included, reminding her that healing was not a single moment, but a chain of small, continuous victories. Back at home, the rhythm had also changed. Jude no longer watched Amara with the cautious gaze of a man fearing cracks in glass. Instead, his glances had softened into admiration, the way a man looks at someone who fought an invisible war and came back stronger. Mama Ezen had returned to the village, but not before holding Amara close one last time, whispering something only mothers of a certain age could say without sounding like they were giving instructions. "You're not who you were, and that's a good thing. Let the new woman grow." Nina had grown too. Her eyes followed movement now, her smile responding to familiar voices. Amara began to notice the ways her daughter's presence filled the house, not just physically but emotionally. Where once she had heard Nina's cries as a reminder of her failings, now she listened to them as proof of life. She held her differently now, not with hesitation, but with a calm curiosity, watching the small fingers curl around hers, the breath rise and fall against her chest. She whispered stories into her ears, small ones, about stars and trees and birds that could only be found in the kind of childhood she wanted Nina to have. Even her feeding moments, once filled with discomfort, had become pockets of peace. The baby suckled as if she too could feel her mother's steady return. In quiet hours, Amara sat with Jude, sometimes not talking at all, but resting in the knowledge that the silence no longer echoed with pain. It was at last just silence. There were days, of course, when the fog still crept in through unseen doors, mornings when her breath came out too fast, or nights when sleep refused to arrive, hovering just beyond reach like an old debt unpaid. But she no longer feared these moments. She had learned to sit with them, to acknowledge their presence without letting them decide the course of her day. Evelyn had once told her that some wounds never vanish, they just stop bleeding. Amara understood now. She no longer searched for the girl she used to be in mirrors or dreams. That girl had served her time, carried her through youthful days and early womanhood. The woman she had become was more deliberate, more aware of her boundaries, her emotions, and most importantly, her value. One afternoon, while rearranging the storage room, Evelyn handed her a brown envelope. "You've been here long enough," she said, smiling. "I think it's time you stopped being just a house help." Inside was a certificate of training for basic caregiving and a recommendation letter, signed and sealed. "You've helped more women in this house than you realize," Evelyn added. "It's time you see yourself the way others see you." Amara held the papers with trembling hands, not because of what they meant to the outside world, but because of what they confirmed within her. She had not just returned, she had transformed. Evenings became her favorite part of the day, a quiet bridge between work and home. She would often take the longer route back, walking past the bakery where the scent of warm bread clung to the street, past the little school where children played barefoot in the dust. It reminded her that life, for all its chaos, always found a way to move forward. On one of those evenings, Jude met her halfway, Nina strapped to his chest, fast asleep. They didn't say much as they walked together. The road ahead wasn't paved with certainty. There were still bills, dreams not yet fulfilled, days that would demand more than they could give, but there was peace in knowing they'd face it side by side. When they reached the house, Amara stepped inside and placed her bag by the door. She stood in front of the mirror without fear, without expectation. She didn't ask it any questions. She didn't search for anything. And for the first time in a long time, it wasn't silent. It didn't speak in words, but in recognition. The woman staring back at her was no longer a stranger. She was someone who had walked through fire with blistered feet and made it to the other side, not untouched, but alive. She smiled, not for the mirror, but for herself. And this time the smile stayed. Dear listener, no matter how far you feel you've drifted from yourself, always remember, your story is not finished. Healing doesn't always come loud or fast. Sometimes it comes in silence, in small steps, in people who choose to stay, in purpose rediscovered. You're not weak for feeling tired. You are not broken because you cried. Your strength is not in hiding your pain. It's in rising slowly, gently, again and again. May your heart never stay stuck in places your spirit has outgrown. May you find strength when the world gives you none, and peace that quiets every fear you dare not speak. May your hands never lack purpose, and your soul never run dry. May the people around you be your shelter, your strength, and not your storm. May every silent cry receive an answer, and every shadowed part of you come back into the light. May joy sneak into your days, and rest find its way into your nights. May your mind be sound, your feet steady, your love returned, and your healing whole. And may every broken piece of you rise again, stronger, wiser, softer. If you believe it, let your amen shake the dust off your soul.
Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.